want to thank my fellow panelists for being here today. Matt Axelrod, right next to me, is the Secretary of Commerce's Assistant Secretary for Industry and Security, where he oversees, among other things, the export portfolio. And he also did about 13 years at Department of Justice before going to the private sector and then coming back into the administration after January 20th. John Carlin, at the end, has spent most of his career at the Department of Justice, holding some of the highest ranking positions, including Assistant Attorney General for National Security, overseeing every national security related case. And then as the acting Deputy Attorney General, which he was sworn in immediately after President Biden was sworn in on January 20th, 2021. Let's start off with you, Matt. Can you give us, to start, a high-level overview of what your position is and what your bureau is, and then why it's important, why it was important for you to come talk to this investment community?
Sure, thanks, Mark, and thanks for all of you for being here. So yeah, I'm the Assistant Secretary for Export Enforcement, which means I lead a team of federal agents and intelligence analysts whose mission is to keep our country's most sensitive technologies out of the world's most dangerous hands. A lot of that means dual use technologies, which means capable of regular, ordinary civilian use, but also capable of military use. So I'll give you an example. A GPU, which is an advanced computer chip, is the type of chip that allows lots of graphical images to be processed very quickly. It's the kind of chip that's in your kid's Xbox. And that's great. We want US companies to be able to sell those chips to companies that are making video game consoles. But it's also the type of chip that's used by the Chinese government to do facial recognition systems to repress the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. And obviously, we don't want US companies selling computer chips that are going to be used for that purpose. But the challenge is it's the very same chip. So figuring out where things are going and what they're going to be used for is a key part of our mission. And we have agents stationed in field offices across the country who work hard every day to do that. When we have evidence that supports a criminal violation of the export rules, we work with the Department of Justice to bring criminal cases, and then we also bring administrative enforcement actions through the Department of Commerce.
Thanks. And you know, for the past several years, the profile of the cases, the export, you have a few a year. But lately, like I saw you on TV 2 days ago announcing some major cases. Is there a renewed push by the administration? And if so, what's new about that? And maybe touch on what you announced 2 days ago.
Yeah, sure. Look, the reason I think it was important to come up from DC to talk with you all today, you're the ones who allocate capital, you're the ones investing, and I think it's important to be aware that the world and US national security policy is undergoing a change. If you go back 20 years, certainly I don't have to tell people sitting here in Manhattan that the #1 national security threat to the US, right after 9/11 was the threat from non-state actors and terrorism. And now in 2023, if you look at the annual threat assessment that the national intelligence community puts out every year, terrorism, of course, is still a threat, but it's not the #1 threat. The very beginning of that report points out the greatest threat to our country's national security at present comes from nation-state actors, places like China and Russia and Iran and North Korea. And so part of that threat is their attempts to acquire advanced US technology in order to modernize their military to such a degree that it can eventually overtake ours and shift the balance of power in the world. That obviously would be a very bad thing from our perspective, and it's something we work hard every day to combat. What Marc was referring to with the cases is we co-launched a disruptive technology strike force with the Department of Justice to get after this problem, to focus attention and resources between DOJ and Commerce and the FBI and Homeland Security to make sure that we have people sort of dedicated every day to thinking about how we stop these certain advanced disruptive technologies getting to countries of concern and making sure that that doesn't happen, and that when it does happen, we hold people accountable. So yeah, earlier this week we announced 5 enforcement actions from across the country, all different fact patterns, 2 with stuff going to Russia, 2 with China, and then 1 that China and Iran. And we want everyone to know that this is something we're really laser focused on and taking action on.
Thanks. Let's switch gears a little bit. John, so you're the co-chair of data privacy and cybersecurity for Paul Weiss. So help translate the cases that DOJ and Commerce announced this week into why it matters for this audience. What do the investors need to know about those from a risk perspective?
Taking a step back and looking at it from the 30,000-foot vantage point, think about what's going on at the Group of 7 right now. What are the 3 hottest issues in the Group of 7? Number 1, it's the Russian aggression into Ukraine, and what are the countries going to do to stop that aggression? Number 2 is China, and what should the approach be in terms of de-risking the relationship with China? And number 3 is AI, artificial intelligence. Those are the 3 hottest topics for the largest economies in the world. What they all have in common when it comes to United States policy and the implementation of policy is that the way the United States is attempting to work with countries around the world to address each of those issues relies on putting companies on the front lines of national security risk and enforcement in a way that's simply never been true before in our enforcement and regulatory regime. Export is one of those tools, and I'll turn to that in a minute, but if you look across the range of legal tools, so that's where diplomatic efforts focused in terms of trying to come up with parallel regimes in like-minded countries to review foreign investment for national security risk, or the US implementation of that through the Treasury Department, the Committee on Foreign Investment inside the United States, which I used to sit. And where are they focused? Or if you look at the Treasury Department and its unprecedented use of sanctions, and then the Justice Department's announcement that sanctions are the new Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, by which they meant it's the new top enforcement priority criminally for the Justice Department. Or when you start looking around cybersecurity risk, and here with Commerce, this shift that Matt's describing, where the old Commerce, old CFIUS, and even the old sanctions regime was really focused on how do we keep the proliferation of weapons out of the hands of countries that might use them against US soldiers? How do we keep the supply chain for things like missiles inside the United States? Now that shift has turned to data and to the infrastructure that ultimately supports the digital economy. And so you see things like CFIUS blocking a Chinese acquisition of a dating app, Grindr. That's unheard of. You never think of that as national security risk, say 10, 15 years ago. Or the example, I think, that Matt gave of these dual-use chips that are used in gaming machines, but have other applications. I think that's the key shift when you're thinking about business risk. And that geopolitical turn, it's in progress now, but I don't really see it getting better over the next, say, 5 years. So when you're thinking through opportunities, but also risks in your investment, one of the things you need to keep in mind is, what do we do if there is a forced decoupling between China and the United States? Where do we see the enforcement pendulum moving as we head into the future? The 5 cases that were brought this week and the resources being applied to bring them, I think, demonstrate what the risks are. You had one in particular with severe penalties, and that had to do with Seagate giving export control technology to Huawei. You're going to continue to see that very precise enforcement focus in export and with the use of these other legal tools.
So I think Matt will talk more about that case. I think it was a $300 million settlement, which everybody in this room should be alert to. So, John, you talked about kind of the all tools approach where you have justice, commerce, treasury, and others working in unison. One thing that has been in the press lately has not been announced formally or put in, but what can you say to this audience about the outbound investment executive order that's in the works, and how that could also impact folks in the investment community?
Yeah, a lot of concern right now, I know, among my clients about what is the outbound investment regime going to look like. So for those who aren't tracking, you already have the inbound set of restrictions. That's the Committee on Foreign Investment, United States, when there's a change in foreign investment. And that regime has undergone drastic change. 10 years ago, when I was leading the National Security Division, we brought first case of its kind, the indictment of 5 members of the People's Liberation Army, a specialized unit, 61398. And the facts behind that case were that, hey, this wasn't traditional espionage. What we were seeing these actors do in uniform was target private companies for the benefit of their competitors overseas. And the idea that that was the day job of the second largest military in the world led to a change. Okay, if that's what they're pursuing through hacking, are there other ways that they can obtain either this technology or personally identifiable information about individuals through acquisitions? And you saw a new act, the Foreign Investment Review Modernization Act in 2018, and the new regulations enforcing that act. I think for folks going through the process now, people are still trying to figure out how aggressive is this committee going to be, and where can I do accept investments? How can I sell to foreign buyers? That's on the inbound side. The outbound question is, okay, if what we're concerned about is, from the US government's perspective, is that transfer of technology and know-how overseas, are there certain outbound investments that's not necessarily the product, that would fall within Matt's regime, where it's a particular type of technology that requires a license, but what about the know-how that comes from consultants or that comes along with the US dollar? Or are there certain sectors that we just shouldn't encourage the US dollar at all because of this strategic competition between the US and China? I don't know when that regime is going to come out. There have been a lot of public discussion about the debates about whether it should be it should cover a wide-ranging flow of outbound investments. Should it in the beginning be more of a transparency regime that requires you to notify, essentially, of the investments that you're making overseas, so then they can do more research and decide later whether they want to restrict that outbound investment. So I think more to see there coming up in the fall or winter. There's a vigorous debate within the administration. And then lastly, with outbound investment, part of that debate is, should this be a unilateral tool? Is this something the United States should announce unilaterally, or should it work with foreign partners so that it's multilateral? Otherwise, you could restrict a certain type of outbound investment here or consulting, and the gap will immediately get filled by other countries.
All right, thanks. And Matt, about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, Silverado interviewed you when you first got sworn in, and you talked about a lot of your goals for the new position you were in. And then a few weeks ago, you announced a policy clarifying the voluntary self-disclosures. Can you talk about that a little bit and maybe try to localize it to this audience?
Yeah, sure. So as the government, as an enforcement agency, we want people to come tell us when they realize that there may have been a violation of our rules. And so if you have portfolio companies that may have gotten sideways with us, it is always better to come knock on our door before we come knock on yours. And we have policies in place to incentivize those voluntary self-disclosures, and they've been in place for a while in terms of you get concrete sort of reductions in any potential penalty. We treat you better if you walk yourself in, right? And so that's the incentive to walk yourself in. What we clarified a few weeks ago was if you are in that situation and make the choice not to walk yourself in. And look, I was in private practice advising companies for 4 years in between my government service. And that's obvious. I get that it's a hard question, right? We've realized we have a problem. We're going to remediate it, clean it up, put policies in place to make sure it doesn't happen again. But then do we go the extra step of going and telling the government about it? Well, to sort of help sharpen that risk calculus a little bit, what we announced a few weeks ago is it's not just you get a benefit if you come in, it's if you don't come in and then later we find out about it, we are going to treat it as an aggravating factor. In other words, we're going to treat you, we treat you better if you walk yourself in, we treat you a little worse if you choose not to. And so we did that in order to further try to incentivize folks from walking themselves in, because this violations of our rules and laws is really serious stuff, not just because we consider it serious because it's our job to enforce them, but because, as I explained at the top, it's all designed to protect what are now sort of front and center core national security interests of the United States.
So to expand a little bit on that for those of you, if you're in this audience and your companies are playing by the rules and you see others that are not, isn't there a mechanism in place now for you to kind of voluntarily self-disclose for somebody else?
Yeah,
and,
no.
And is there some sort of mechanism to recognize that help?
Yeah. So thanks, Mark. So that's the second half of the policy we put out a few weeks ago, which is telling us about the misconduct of others. We want companies to comply with our rules. The worst thing in the world would be if you're complying with the rules and your competitor, the company's portfolio company's competitors aren't and keep selling, and so then your portfolio company feels like a chump, right? Hey, we're playing by the rules, but we're the only ones. Our competitors keep selling and booking revenue and maybe even taking our market share. That's not fair. We agree that's not fair. We want to ensure a level playing field, but we can't do that if we don't know about the misconduct. So we want you to come tell us, and to help incentivize that, if you do, and we bring an enforcement action against your competitors, we'll consider that extraordinary cooperation by you, and we will give you some credit in the bank, basically. In other words, if then your portfolio company ever gets in trouble with us down the road, it is a factor, among other factors, that we'll consider when we're figuring out what the appropriate resolution is. That's been a part of our policy for a while, but we had never sort of lifted it up and explained it to people in the way that we did a few weeks ago.
All right, and John mentioned the Seagate-Huawei settlement. Can you, the $300 million settlement, can you talk a little bit about that? And again, kind of illustrate why it matters to the investment community.
Yeah, sure. Seagate's a good example of that level playing field that I talked about, right? There were 3 companies worldwide that were selling hard disk drives to Huawei. And Huawei, I think, as folks probably know, is a restricted party for such sales under, we have an entity list, they're on it, and we had a rule called the Foreign Direct Product Rule, which is a little technical, but basically means even if something's not going from the US to Huawei, if it's going from some other country to Huawei, but it was manufactured using US technology, our rules restrict it too. Once we put that rule in place, 2 of the 3 people who sold hard disk drives to Huawei stopped selling. Seagate kept selling. And they kept selling and selling and selling, and that's what cost them $300 million with us. And I think there are a couple takeaways from that resolution. One is that our administrative enforcement authorities are pretty powerful. Like, that wasn't a criminal case. The Department of Justice wasn't involved. That was just commerce, but it was still a $300 million penalty. 2, the Foreign Direct Product Rule is something to be aware of. It's not just with respect to Huawei, but there are also foreign direct product rules involved in sales of items to Russia and with semiconductors to China. So if you are, or your portfolio companies are in the business of selling those items to those markets, you got to be aware of the foreign direct product rule because we are enforcing it. And then the third thing I'd say is, don't go rushing past the red flags, and if you're in an industry where like there are 3 competitors and 2 stop selling once we put a rule in, like that's a pretty big red flag. And if you have questions about, hey, are we on the right side of this or the wrong side of this? Come talk to us, seek an advisory opinion, seek a license to do what you want to do. Come talk to one of our agents who we have all around the country. Like, we're the Department of Commerce. We want to help you do business, but we also want to make sure that you're doing business in a way that doesn't violate our rules and doesn't harm our national security.
Well, thank you both. We are out of time, unfortunately, but as I mentioned in the beginning, we're going to stick around up here, turn our microphones off, and we encourage anybody that wants to continue the conversation or ask questions that you might have to come up. And thank you very much. Thank our panel.